All right, we're here with Erin Banco. Thanks for speaking to us about your experiences. I guess the first question is, here you're born in the United States and you end up in the Middle East. Tell us how you got to the Middle East.
Okay, sure. So I grew up in Medfield, Massachusetts, which is a small town just outside of Boston. I went to a small private school in downtown Boston and took some writing courses in high school that I really enjoyed, and some history courses. And I knew I wanted to be a writer one day, but I just didn't know how I would become a writer or what kind of writer I wanted to become. And then I went to University of Wisconsin for college, and I majored in Arabic and journalism. I chose Arabic because I wasn't getting any better with my Spanish, and I wanted to learn a new language. And so I just put two and two together and decided that the Middle East was really where I wanted to end up eventually. I ended up taking a job in Washington, D.C. just out of college. I stepped off the plane, spent a few weeks studying, and I went down to what's known as Tahrir Square, which is in the center of downtown Cairo. It's the largest landmark, or most historic landmark, I would say, in Cairo, besides the pyramids, which are actually in Giza. But when I got to Cairo, I remember my parents telling me, now don't go anywhere near that square because we know that there's violence there will be tear gas, there will be tanks, and people die there.
Wasn't Anderson Cooper, CNN, if I remember right, he was kind of getting beat up a little bit.
So reporters had been there the year before. So this was an entire year after the initial protests had broken out. I had gotten there for the 1-year anniversary of the initial protests. So the year before that, there had been very high-profile journalists who had been attacked, like Anderson Cooper, like Lara Logan. A lot of really big, well-known news anchors had been attacked. So I knew before going into that situation that there was some danger there. But this was my first chance to really take a stab at becoming an international freelance journalist, and I ended up starting my international journalism experience in that square.
So what was the first story that you wrote about?
The first story that I wrote about was actually, when I got there, it was about the relations between the U.S. non-governmental organizations and the Egyptian government. I think about 17 to 25 different members, Americans, who were operating in Egypt with different NGOs, had been arrested and were being held in the U.S. Embassy, and they were going to be put on trial because the Egyptian government had accused them of operating illegally within the country. So my first story was actually about U.S.-Egyptian relations. My second story was about the upcoming presidential election and the protests that were happening regarding that.
What are like 2 or 3 things that they were, and you could still say today, are protesting about?
Okay, so...
I mean, we're in America here, and to us to see widespread protests seems foreign to us. Well, it is foreign to us.
Right.
So what is different about Egypt than this country?
So the thing to understand about Egypt is that once the 2011 revolution started, protests were the main way for the people of Egypt to voice their opinions, to demand things from their government. And these protests aren't small. They aren't a couple of people like we see in America maybe picketing outside of their local courthouse or whatever. These are large-scale protests. 100, 200,000 people, up to 1 million people in this one square protesting one thing. And so the thing to know about Egypt right now is that protests continue to be the main form of dissent and the main way that Egyptians protest their government or demand things from their government. And right now what we're seeing in Egypt is that the president of Egypt has passed a brand new constitution, right? So we know our constitution has not changed at all, and that's what we pride ourselves on in the U.S. Well, Egypt has just written a brand new constitution and passed it with a brand new president, and a lot of people are upset about what is in this new constitution. So the protests we're seeing right now are the people protesting what the government has put in place for them in their constitution.
So would this change in the constitution be like they're afraid they're going to get their freedom, their democracy taken away, those kinds of things?
Yep, so the president right now in Egypt is the former leader of the Muslim Brotherhood Party. A lot of people have misconceptions about what the Muslim Brotherhood actually is and who those people actually are. But they have a huge presence in Egypt. And when the presidential elections happened, this candidate, President Morsi, or Mohammed Morsi, came out of the Muslim Brotherhood Party and ran for president. So the people that are protesting the government right now are against the party that he came from, are against the ideals and the practices that the Muslim Brotherhood promotes.
Is everyone in Egypt, are they all Muslim, strong Muslim? Women have to be completely covered.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like?
Egypt is a country that has become increasingly conservative over the years.
What does that mean, conservative?
Meaning that it has become a more pious country. Women are covering up more. Back in the 60s and 70s, women could wear shorts and walk around like we do in the U.S. But now in Egypt, you would never see that unless you're on the coast, or unless you're with extremely wealthy families who are not very religious and who spend most of their time in beach resorts.
Would you not see that because people are just accepting a new type of religion, or are they doing it out of fear that I better wear long pants because I'm going to get beat up if I don't?
I don't think I have an answer for that, because I think that this is a debate that has been going on for a lot of years in terms of why has Egypt become more conservative, what has driven women in the country to cover up more. I mean, my own personal opinion is that the government in Egypt is becoming increasingly, they have been promoting more and more the Islamist ideals that the Muslim Brotherhood promote, and that is because our new president, or the Egyptian president, is from that party. So written into this new constitution, a lot of the more liberal Egyptians feel that they won't have the freedom that they had back in the 60s and 70s because this new president had come out of this very conservative Islamist party.
Why did the people of Egypt vote for him? Why didn't they? Because
a lot of people in Egypt are like Mohammed Morsi and feel the same way about Islam that he does, and agree with a lot of his practices and a lot of his ideals. And so that's what I mean when I say that Egypt is becoming increasingly pious, increasingly conservative, is that the majority of the country are Muslim. Mm-hmm. And you have a very small a very small percentage that are Christian, Coptic.
How are they being treated since the Arab Spring started?
Who?
Christians.
There's always been a really huge split, and I don't want to say rivalry, but dissent between the Coptic Christians and the Muslims in Egypt. But I think they would say that they're being treated much differently now than when the former president was in place. I don't necessarily know if that's true. Mm-hmm. I haven't spent much time on that subject, but of course it's possible. Yeah.
Did you meet any people, any interesting stories just within Egypt that are worth sharing?
Sure. I mean, I was there for a lot of the protests leading up to the actual election in Egypt, where people were being killed and tear gas was everywhere. I remember those protests very well because, I mean, it's very hard to forget those days that I was there. But I was actually in Tahrir Square when the new president, Mohammed Morsi, was announced as the winner of the election. And most of the people that were in the square were his supporters. So it was very interesting to be there during that time, seeing the reactions from the people around me. And I actually spent a lot of my time reporting during the days of the election in his headquarters. I actually got to meet the president. So it was a very interesting time to be in Egypt. But it was much different than my experiences traveling elsewhere in the Middle East. For the most part, I wasn't in any direct danger when I was in the square. I was usually with a bunch of other journalists who were there as well. but definitely the protesting and just the amount of energy in the square at one time was very nerve-wracking for me. And honestly, I would say that I felt more unsafe reporting in Egypt in the square sometimes than I did reporting, for example, in Syria. Also because I'm a female Western reporter, reporting in Egypt is much more difficult.
Why is it more difficult?
You know, first of all, being a Westerner in Egypt is very difficult because you stand out, right? And so as a reporter, people tend to notice you more. As a female reporter, there aren't many female reporters in Egypt, or many women who aren't wearing headscarves or who aren't dressed in long black calabayas. So again, I stood out more. And also a lot of Egyptians don't like the U.S. They don't like America. They don't like Americans.
Why don't they like us?
Well,
because of 30 seconds.
Because a lot of our government's policies and our government's actions over the past year and a half to 2 to 3 years have not been what they wanted, or have not been what they needed. And so a lot of Egyptians don't care for American. And I think that there's a stereotype that as a Western woman, especially in that country, that there are certain stereotypes that Western women are available for Egyptian men to have or to date or to try to have. And so that was very nerve-wracking for me, especially when I looked the way I did in that square and could be pinpointed very easily and targeted very easily. I had a lot of female journalist friends who were attacked in the square, and so that was something that I knew could happen, and so I think that's why I was more on edge in that square than I was, say, in a war zone.
Well, let's talk about a war zone. You not only were in Egypt, but you were also where else?
So I was in Turkey, Jordan, and Syria.
Okay,
So
why were you in Syria?
I was covering the Syrian conflict, and I was also in Jordan and Turkey covering the Syrian conflict. So all of those travels were based on my work.
Now, this Syrian war, that's not in Jordan or Turkey.
No. So the reason I was in Turkey and Jordan is because hundreds of thousands of Syrians have fled their country and are now living in refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan, the bordering countries of Syria.
Okay, so these are Syrians that don't want to see the face of war, so they're fleeing.
Yes.
How far of a journey is that? How long are they walking,
Well, it depends.
riding?
It depends where they're coming from in Syria, right?
Okay.
So, actually, if they get to the border of Syria, the actual trek from Syria to, say, Turkey is about a 7-hour trek through the mountains.
Is that a safe voyage? Dangerous voyage?
It's a very dangerous voyage.
What could happen to them?
Well, leaving Syria is the problem. The government in Syria does not want its people to leave the country. They don't want people spilling over into Turkey, into Jordan. And so the biggest fear for these people leaving was that they'd be shot and killed as they're leaving the country. And
Are these mainly women, children?
No, not mainly women and children. I think a lot of women and children for sure. But there are also men that are coming from Syria that are trying to take their mother, their wife, their kids to safety.
So the government isn't kind of choosing who necessarily to kill or not. If you're trying to flee and you're a 6-year-old girl, there's a chance that you're going to get killed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, in these refugee camps in Turkey, Jordan, and elsewhere, what does that look like?
Well, the situations in Turkey and Jordan are very, very different. The way that the government has set up the refugee camps in both of the countries is very different. So in Turkey, the refugee camps are run solely by the Turkish government. If you go to Jordan, the refugee camps are run by large non-governmental organizations.
Are those non-government organizations, are they like
The
European-based? UN?
No, the UN. So all of the supplies, for example, in Jordan, at the Zatri refugee camp, which is basically the only refugee camp in Jordan right now for Syrians, it has about 10 lots. It has different sections, but it's called the Zatri refugee camp. And all of those supplies are donated by the UN. Now, the UN doesn't necessarily have their hands right in the middle of what's going on in the refugee camps. They are just donating all the supplies.
Is that stuff coming from tax dollars from the United States? So I guess my question is, are we paying?
Are we paying? No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think these supplies are allocated by the UN. Okay, so for example, each UN office has a certain budget each year. This budget for Jordan, we didn't budget for this crisis, right? The UN didn't budget for this crisis. Mm-hmm. So Jordan is seeing, like I said, tens of thousands of refugees coming into their country. But they aren't able to ask for more money. They're only able to use the money that they were allotted from the year before. So they're not able to provide for the Syrians like they should be able to provide for the Syrians. So no extra money is coming from any outside sources. It's just what the UN has allocated from the year before.
Okay, so were you in the Jordan refugee camp?
Yes, yeah.
You said tens of thousands?
Yep, so hundreds of thousands have fled Syria, but tens of thousands are within this camp.
And you said 10 lots of, I don't know what that means.
Okay, so it keeps expanding. It started with 5 lots.
What's a lot?
A lot it's rows of tents.
Okay.
So I don't know exactly how many rows of tents are in each lot, but it continues to expand. So I would say a lot, you could think of like a football field.
Okay.
Okay, and that has expanded to now 10, maybe 12 lots.
Are kids getting education in these refugee camps?
There are some, like I said, some activists and NGO type people that are working within these camps to set up small learning spaces for the children there, but they're definitely not getting formal education now.
And you would need to be able to speak Arabic to teach those.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it so bad that people are getting diseases and dying of like dysentery and things like that?
Oh yeah, the Zatri. I talked to actually the head of the Jordan office for the UN, and he said that the Zatri refugee camp was one of the worst refugee camps he's seen in his lifetime, and he's been in refugee camps in Iraq, Afghanistan, some of the worst refugee camps that we know of. He said that this refugee camp is actually much, much worse in terms of conditions. It's in the middle of the desert. The conditions are horrible. Dust storms, sandstorms. There's scorpions running around everywhere. And in terms of medical supplies that are there, they're very limited. The only supplies that are really there are for people who are coming through the border that need to be treated right away for trauma. So their leg has been broken or blown off or what have you. But the real crisis, I think, in this situation and in these refugee camps is the mental health crisis that's going on within these refugee camps. And
what do you mean by that?
And so what I mean is that these people have come from a war-torn country. They've been living with bombs falling around them for months, seeing their family members die in front of them. And they're fleeing to these refugee camps and don't have any support. There's no one for them to talk to. There's no one for them to counsel them. And so they're suffering from severe PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So, for example, the children can't sleep at night. They wake up with nightmares. Grown women are peeing their pants because they can't control their bladders. I mean, these are all signs of mental health illnesses.
So the one thing we talk about is how, the people who start the wars aren't the only ones that feel the effects. Everyone feels the effects of war. What effects are people seeing in Syria itself? What have you? I guess let's real brief talk about what's going on. Why are they fighting? Who's fighting? What's that all about?
Okay, so Syria was also part of what we know today as the Arab Spring. The people of Syria started protesting against their government after Tunisia, after Egypt. To put it very simply and bluntly, a lot of the people living in Syria did not want their president as as their president. They wanted a new government. And so that's how this whole conflict started. Protests started breaking out. And when I say protests, I mean huge protests like I was talking about in Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of people would come out to large cities in Syria and protest against their government. The government started fighting back violently, shooting into crowds, killing people, and then the bombs started to happen, airstrikes started to happen, and that's when people started fleeing Syria. And since then, an opposition group has risen up against the government.
Is this group Syrians themselves?
These are Syrians themselves, men who have organized themselves to fight against the government. They call themselves the Free Syrian Army, or FSA for short, and they are receiving weapons and money from the Gulf states and are
using... What do you mean by Gulf states?
So Saudi Arabia, Qatar.
So countries in the Middle East.
Countries in the Middle East that are on the Gulf, that are sending them supplies and money and weapons to fight the government. And so since those large protests have broken out, this FSA army has been able to fight back against the government and take over key areas within Syria. And sort of now it's like a tug of war now. So no one's giving in, and people will continue to die until there is...
How many have died so far?
Well, when I was in Syria, I think it was 30,000. It has risen since then.
So we're getting close to the size of the entire population of Reading.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So...
is that number going to... Do you see an end in sight? I mean, I just read in the news about people waiting in line at a bakery for bread.
300 people were killed.
The government bombed that line.
Yes.
So this isn't like we're going to go to the battleground and we're going to fight a battle and that decides how this ends.
Right. So when we think of war, at least for kids in high school, when they think of war, they think of the Civil War, American Revolution, right? You think of men walking to the front lines and shooting and fighting the enemy, and then whoever's left standing wins. This is not like that at all. This warfare, there is no front line. The Free Syrian Army has taken over random different cities in Syria. The government is no longer really sending men out into the streets to fight the Free Syrian Army. They're just using airstrikes to fight back. So they're bombing random locations like bakeries, for example, where they know a lot of people will be.
Why would the pilot do it? Why would the pilot pull the trigger? Why is anyone still supporting the leader?
So what's happened since the conflict has started is that a lot of military personnel from the government have what we call defected. They have left the military and have gone to the other side to fight. Now, a lot of people are still with the government, too. That doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with the government. There is intimidation going on within the country. If you leave our government forces, we will kill you and your family. There is some of that going on. It's money for them. It's security for them. So I don't think that we can say that everybody working for the government necessarily believes in the government. I think that there are a lot of different circumstances that people are under. So.
Okay. Do you have, when you're interviewing the people I'm talking to, do you have one story that that is ingrained in your mind that you care to share?
When I was in Syria, I was stationed in Al-Bab, which is a part of Aleppo, and Aleppo is the largest city in Syria, and it's in the northernmost part of the country. And I didn't go down to what we called Salahuddin, which was the main battleground for Aleppo, where snipers were shooting at each other, and the FSA had really taken over, and that's where the main fighting was happening and the bullets were fighting. I stayed out of that area, but I stayed in this town called Al-Bab, and I met this one family who had lost their son, and their son was 13 years old, and I talked to the brother and the dad and the mom, and the little boy that I met told me about the story of how his brother had left that morning to go to school during the summer. He was taking college courses, and he was caught in the middle of a fight between the government and the FSA, and was shot and killed, and he was 13 years old. And so I remember that being one of the most difficult interviews that I did, because it was not being told by an adult, but it was being told by the little boy's younger brother. And he was sitting in the same room that he used to share with his brother, and he was wearing his brother's clothing, and it was a very morbid interview, obviously, but it was one that I think will stick with me forever, just because it was being told through the mouth of a young boy, and that was very difficult for me, obviously, but it was also very telling of what this conflict has done to the country, and how many lives have been lost. And it was a true testament to sort of the tragic side of the conflict, and sort of how it's really affecting the people, and how they're dealing with it today.
I guess we could end with these last two questions. One, where do you see Syria a year or so from now? And two, why should we care?
Okay, where do I see Syria a year from? Okay, I hope that the fighting will have ended. I don't necessarily think that that will be the case. I think that the fighting will probably intensify before it dies down, unfortunately. We had, the UN had an envoy, used to be Kofi Annan. He resigned, and now we have a new UN liaison that has been going into Syria and he's trying to negotiate deals between the two sides, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I think that as long as those discussions don't go anywhere, the fighting will continue, and people will continue to die, and that death toll will continue to rise. And so I think that in a year from now, we'll have a real refugee humanitarian crisis in Turkey and Jordan. I think that these countries will no longer know how to deal with all of the Syrians that they have in their country, and no longer know how to provide for them. The money is going to run out because people will continue to flee Syria. And so I think that the main problem that we'll have is dealing with these refugees in these new countries. That's my main concern.
All right. Well, thanks for talking to me about
Sure.
the situation. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.